Divorce is usually a tragedy of split assets and broken hearts, a painful unraveling of shared lives, but sometimes it is a meticulously orchestrated masterclass in deception. Richard Sterling sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Manhattan's most ruthless family law attorney, a smug, impenetrable smile plastered across his face as he pushed the final settlement toward his weeping wife. He was leaving her with nothing. No alimony, no apartment, just a rusted 10-year-old Volvo and a mountain of credit card debt he had secretly engineered. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted a naive, unambitious barista. He did not know he had just legally severed himself from the sole heiress to the $14 billion Cavendish global shipping empire. Richard Sterling was a man who believed the universe owed him greatness. At 34, he was a senior director at a boutique private equity firm in Midtown Manhattan, pulling in mid-six figures and carrying himself like a billionaire. He wore custom Italian wool suits, obsessed over his Rolex collection, and treated every interaction as a negotiation he was destined to win. His wife, Beatrice, was the only piece of his life that didn't fit the aesthetic. When they met 5 years prior, Richard had found her charming in a pathetic, rescued stray sort of way. Beatrice was working at an independent bookstore in Brooklyn, wearing oversized faded cardigans and completely devoid of makeup. She was quiet, submissive, and seemingly terrified of the fast-paced New York elite. Richard liked that. He liked coming home to a woman who looked at him like he was a god among men. He enjoyed explaining basic financial concepts to her, relishing her blank, wide-eyed stares. But as Richard climbed the corporate ladder, Beatrice became an embarrassment. She refused to attend his firm's galas, claiming the crowds gave her panic attacks. When she did accompany him to dinners, she ordered tap water and picked at her food, offering nothing to the conversations about offshore tax havens or Hampton real estate. Then came Chloe. Chloe Brentwood was a junior vice president at Richard's firm. She wore stiletto heels that clicked sharply against the marble floors, drank dirty martinis, and looked at Richard with a hungry, predatory ambition that mirrored his own. Within weeks of their first shared cab ride, they were sleeping together in high-end hotels across the city. Richard's plan to discard Beatrice was clinical. He spent 14 months carefully siphoning his assets. He redirected his massive annual bonuses into a hidden LLC registered in Delaware under his mother's maiden name. He took out lines of credit in Beatrice's name, having forged her signature, to pay for extravagant business expenses that were actually weekend getaways with Chloe to St. Bart's and Aspen. When he finally dropped the papers on their cheap IKEA dining table, he played the victim. "We're just on different paths, B," Richard had said, adjusting his French cuffs. "I'm building an empire. You're content reading paperback novels and working for minimum wage. I need a partner who challenges me." Beatrice had collapsed into tears, burying her face in her hands. She begged him to stay, promising she would change, promising she would start dressing better, attending the parties, being the wife he needed. Her desperation fueled Richard's ego. It proved everything he believed about himself. He was the prize, and she was nothing without him. Now, sitting in the imposing, glass-walled conference room of Crenshaw, Webb and Associates on Wall Street, Richard felt nothing but triumphant relief. Across the polished mahogany table sat Beatrice. She looked smaller than usual, drowning in a beige thrift store trench coat. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her trembling hands. Beside her sat her court-appointed mediator, a tired-looking man who clearly had a backlog of 50 other cases, and wanted this over with just as badly as Richard did. Richard's attorney, Jonathan Crenshaw, a shark in a three-piece suit who billed $800 an hour, leaned forward. "Let's review the terms one final time, Mrs. Sterling," Crenshaw said, his tone dripping with practiced condescension. "My client is agreeing to assume the remaining lease on the Tribeca apartment. You will retain ownership of the 2014 Volvo. As for the financial accounts, you are both waiving the right to spousal support. You will assume the $22,000 in consumer debt associated with the cards in your name. Mr. Sterling will retain his personal investments and retirement accounts, which predate the marriage or have been kept strictly separate. A clean break." Beatrice sniffled, looking down at the massive stack of legal documents. I don't understand how the credit cards got so high. I only buy groceries." Richard sighed loudly, rolling his eyes at his lawyer. "Bay, we've been over this. Inflation, cost of living. You never knew how to budget. I'm doing you a favor by not coming after your bookstore wages." "I have nothing, Richard," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Where am I supposed to go?" "You'll figure it out," Richard said, checking his watch. He had a lunch reservation at Le Bernardin with Chloe in an hour to celebrate his newfound freedom. "Sign the papers, B. Don't drag this out. It's pathetic." The conference room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant, muffled sirens from the streets below. Beatrice picked up the cheap plastic ballpoint pen her mediator had handed her. Her hand shook so violently that she dropped the pen twice. Richard watched her with a mixture of pity and revulsion. He couldn't believe he had wasted 5 years of his prime tied down to such a weak, helpless creature. "Before I sign this," Beatrice started, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, her red-rimmed eyes locking directly onto Richard's. "I need to ask you one last time. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" "Christ, B!" Richard groaned, leaning back in his leather executive chair. "Yes, I am certain." "You have read the clause regarding the waiver of all future assets?" she asked. Her voice was still quiet, but the trembling seemed to have stopped. Clause 4B. Both parties irrevocably waive any and all claims, present or future, known or unknown, to the assets, inheritances, trusts, and business interests of the other party. You agree to this? Crenshaw, the lawyer, chuckled softly. "Mrs. Sterling, I assure you, my client is perfectly comfortable waiving his rights to your bookstore earnings. Now, if we could please conclude this." "I need to hear him say it," Beatrice insisted, staring unblinkingly at Richard. Richard smirked. He found her attempt at sounding legally formidable highly amusing. "Yes, B. I irrevocably waive my rights to your massive fortune. Now sign the damn papers." Beatrice looked down. The tears that had been pooling in her eyes suddenly cleared. With swift, fluid motions, she flipped through the pages, signing her name on every required line with practiced precision. Her handwriting, usually a messy scrawl when she left grocery lists on their fridge, was sharp, elegant, and completely unrecognizable to Richard. She pushed the stack of papers across the table to Richard. He didn't hesitate. He took out his engraved Mont Blanc fountain pen, a gift to himself for his last promotion, and signed his name with a dramatic flourish. The notary, a quiet woman sitting at the corner of the table, stepped forward, stamped the documents, and signed them. "Congratulations," Crenshaw said smoothly. "The dissolution of marriage is officially executed. We will file these with the county clerk immediately. You are both legally divorced." Richard smiled, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "Well, good luck, B. Genuinely. I hope you find yourself." "I already have," Beatrice said. The change in the room was not immediate, but it was palpable. Beatrice did not stand up right away. Instead, she reached into the pockets of her oversized, faded trench coat. She pulled out a small packet of makeup wipes and a pocket mirror, Slowly, methodically, she wiped the red, inflamed makeup from around her eyes, makeup she had carefully applied in the lobby bathroom 20 minutes prior to simulate heavy crying. She wiped away the pale foundation that made her look sickly. She ran a hand through her messy hair, pulling it back into a severe, elegant knot at the base of her neck. When she finally stood up, she seemed 3 inches taller. The slouch was gone. The timid, nervous energy had completely evaporated. She stood with the ramrod straight posture of a woman who had been trained from birth to command a room. Richard frowned, pausing at the door. "What are you doing?" Before Beatrice could answer, the heavy double doors of the conference room swung open. Jonathan Crenshaw immediately stood up, his face paling as he recognized the man who had just walked into his firm. It was Thomas Harrison, the senior founding partner of Harrison, Roth and Sinclair, the most elite, terrifying and expensive corporate law firm on the eastern seaboard. Harrison was a man who brokered international mergers and represented old money families. He did not step foot into mid-tier family law offices unless something catastrophic was happening. Harrison, a tall man with silver hair and a bespoke Savile Row suit, completely ignored Crenshaw and Richard. He walked straight past them, flanked by 2 imposing men in dark suits who looked less like paralegals and more like private security. Harrison stopped in front of Beatrice and gave a slight, deeply respectful bow. "The paperwork is finalized, Miss Cavendish?" Harrison asked, his voice a deep, resonant baritone. "It is, Thomas," Beatrice replied. Her voice had transformed. Gone was the squeaky, hesitant tone of the Brooklyn barista. In its place was a sharp, aristocratic, mid-Atlantic clip that commanded absolute authority. "Mr. Sterling has officially and irrevocably signed away all rights to my assets, present and future." Richard let out a short, confused laugh. "Cavendish? What is going on? B, who is this?" Harrison finally turned to look at Richard. His expression was one of mild disgust, as if he had just noticed a cockroach on his shoe. "Mr. Sterling," Harrison said coldly, "allow me to introduce my client, Miss Beatrice Eleanor Cavendish, sole surviving heir to the Cavendish Shipping Corporation, Cavendish Holdings, and the primary beneficiary of the late Lord Arthur Cavendish's estate." Richard blinked. Once. Twice. The words weren't making sense. Cavendish Shipping was a global monolith. They owned half the commercial ports in Europe and a fleet of cargo ships that moved billions of dollars in goods daily. "That's insane," Richard stammered, looking at Crenshaw, hoping his lawyer would shut down this bizarre prank. "Her name is Beatrice Hayes. She works at a bookstore. She's in debt." "Beatrice Hayes was my mother's maiden name," Beatrice said smoothly, picking up her cheap trench coat and draping it over her arm to reveal a tailored black silk blouse underneath. "My grandfather was a very paranoid, very controlling man. He demanded I take my place on the board at 22. I wanted to live a normal life first. I wanted to see if I could survive without the family money. I hid my identity, froze my trusts, and moved to Brooklyn." She walked slowly toward Richard, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. "Then I met you, Richard," she continued, her eyes cold and calculating. "You were so eager to play the savior, so eager to mold me into a silent, obedient little pet. It fascinated me. I thought, perhaps, underneath all that arrogance, there was a man who actually loved me for me, regardless of money." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "Bea, I do. I did." "No, you didn't," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I have known about Chloe Brentwood for 14 months. I have known about the Delaware LLC, where you've been hiding your bonuses. I have known about the credit cards you fraudulently opened in my name." Crenshaw choked on his own spit. "Fraudulently?" "Yes, Mr. Crenshaw," Thomas Harrison interjected smoothly. "We have IP logs, surveillance footage from the bank branches, and digital forensics proving your client forged Miss Cavendish's signature to fund his extramarital affairs. It is a federal offense." Richard backed up a step, his mind spinning, trying to find a way out, a loophole, a way to spin this. Wait, if you're a billionaire, the post-nup. We just signed a post-nup. Half of that is marital property. We were married for 5 years. Beatrice smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile that made Richard's blood run cold. "Did you not read Clause 4b, Richard?" Beatrice asked softly. "You irrevocably waived all claims to my assets, inheritances, and trusts. You insisted on a clean break. You legally forced a pauper's divorce on a billionaire, entirely of your own volition." The silence in the room was absolute. The weight of what Richard had just done crashed down on him. He had spent a year plotting to keep a miserable $400,000, and in doing so, he had willingly and aggressively signed away a legal claim to $7 billion. "Now," Beatrice said, turning toward the door. "Thomas, please ensure the local authorities receive the fraud dossier regarding the credit cards. I believe $22,000 in wire fraud carries a substantial prison sentence." "Immediately, Miss Cavendish," Harrison said. Wait!" Richard lunged forward, his voice cracking with panic. Please, we can talk about this. We can tear up the papers." Beatrice paused in the doorway. She looked back over her shoulder, her gaze sweeping over Richard's custom suit and pale, terrified face. "My grandfather passed away in London 4 hours ago," Beatrice said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "I have an empire to run, Richard. I don't have time for middle management." She stepped out of the office, the heavy mahogany doors closing softly behind her, leaving Richard Sterling standing in the wreckage of his own making. Rain lashed against the tinted windows of the Maybach 62S as it glided seamlessly through Manhattan traffic toward Teterboro Airport. Inside the cavernous, soundproofed cabin, Beatrice Eleanor Cavendish sat in silence, staring at her reflection in the glass. The ghost of the timid Brooklyn barista was completely gone, replaced by the sharp, unyielding profile of a woman who had just inherited the world. Opposite her, Thomas Harrison was already reviewing a thick dossier, his iPad glowing softly in the dim light. He handed her a secure, encrypted satellite phone. "The board has been notified of Lord Arthur's passing," Harrison said, his tone purely professional. "As expected, Gregory Whitmore has already called an emergency meeting at the Canary Wharf headquarters. He is moving quickly, Beatrice. He assumes your 5-year sabbatical in New York has left you ignorant of the current logistical crises in the Rotterdam and Singapore ports. He intends to pitch a vote of no confidence before the ink on your grandfather's death certificate is dry." Beatrice took the phone, her thumb tracing the edge of the screen. Gregory Whitmore, the chief operating officer of Cavendish Shipping, had been a thorn in her grandfather's side for a decade. Whitmore was a corporate vulture, a man who believed the shipping empire should be broken up and sold for parts to private equity firms. "Let Whitmore have his emergency meeting," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a cool, calculating register. "Has the Gulf Stream been prepped?" "Waiting on the tarmac, ma'am. We are cleared for an immediate transatlantic flight path." "Good." Beatrice opened a separate leather folio on the seat beside her. It contained the real reason she had spent 5 years hiding in a dusty Brooklyn bookstore. She hadn't just been running from the pressure, she had been studying. Under the guise of a nobody, she had used her grandfather's vast network of private investigators and forensic accountants, without the board's knowledge, to map every vulnerability, every hidden agenda, and every secret bank account held by the Cavendish executive team. 9 hours later, Beatrice walked into the towering glass and steel monolith of Cavendish Holdings in London. She wore a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford suit that cut a striking, authoritative silhouette, her hair pulled into a sleek, impenetrable twist. The lobby went dead silent as she bypassed the security turnstiles, flanked by Harrison and 4 private security contractors. On the 42nd floor, the boardroom was a theater of chaos. 12 men and 3 women in expensive suits were arguing loudly over profit margins and succession protocols. At the head of the table stood Gregory Whitmore, a ruddy-faced man in his late 50s with a penchant for aggressively loud ties. We cannot allow a 27-year-old girl who has spent the last half-decade pouring coffee in America to control a $14 billion global supply chain, Whitmore was shouting, slamming a palm on the mahogany table. The shareholders will panic. The stock will plummet. We need a transitional CEO immediately. I agree, Gregory. A voice cut through the room. The heavy double doors closed behind Beatrice. The entire room froze. Whitmore's jaw tightened as he watched her approach the head of the table. She did not ask for a seat. She simply stood behind her grandfather's empty leather chair, resting her hands on the backrest. A transitional CEO would be a disaster for stock stability, Beatrice continued, her gaze sweeping over the terrified board members. Which is why there will be no transition. I am assuming immediate unilateral control of Cavendish Holdings, as dictated by Lord Arthur's final will and testament. Whitmore recovered his sneer. Beatrice, sweetheart, we are all grieving Arthur. But this is a business, not a fairy tale. You don't know the first thing about our current crisis. We have 3 container ships detained in Rotterdam due to customs disputes, and our fuel hedging strategy is bleeding capital. Actually, Gregory, Beatrice said, pulling a single flash drive from her pocket and sliding it across the table toward the board secretary. The ships in Rotterdam are detained because you authorized a side deal with a sanctioned Russian shell company to transport undocumented crude oil. A deal you brokered through an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, hoping the resulting customs fines would artificially lower our Q3 earnings, allowing your private equity friends at Blackstone to launch a hostile takeover at a fraction of our valuation. The color rapidly drained from Whitmore's face. That is an absurd fabrication. Slander. It is documented down to the last wire transfer, Beatrice replied, her voice an icy whip. The dossier on the screen behind you contains the IP logs from your personal laptop, your encrypted WhatsApp messages, and the banking manifests. You have breached your fiduciary duty, committed international trade violations, and attempted to defraud this company. The giant digital screen at the end of the room flickered to life, displaying a damning web of financial transactions. Gasps echoed around the table. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Whitmore. You are fired, Gregory. Security is waiting outside to escort you from the building. Furthermore, Cavendish Legal Counsel is currently submitting this evidence to Scotland Yard and the Serious Fraud Office. I suggest you call a very good lawyer. Whitmore opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked around the table for support, but the other board members were suddenly intensely interested in their notepads. Defeated, trembling with a mixture of rage and terror, he turned and walked out of the room. Beatrice slowly pulled out her grandfather's chair and sat down. She adjusted her cuffs, looking at the remaining 14 board members. Now, she said, the absolute ruler of her domain. Let us discuss our fuel hedging strategy. Back in New York, Richard Sterling was enjoying a celebratory lunch that was rapidly turning to ash in his mouth. Le Bernardin was buzzing with the hushed conversations of Manhattan's elite, but Richard heard none of it. He stared blankly at his plate of thinly pounded yellowfin tuna. Across from him, Chloe Brentwood was recounting a story about a rival firm, laughing as she sipped her Sancerre. And then he actually thought he could secure the mezzanine financing without— "Richard, are you even listening to me?" Chloe snapped, her perfectly manicured eyebrows knitting together in annoyance. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry. "B is a billionaire." Chloe paused, her wine glass hovering halfway to her mouth. She let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "What? Did she buy a lottery ticket with her minimum wage paycheck?" "No, Chloe, I'm serious." Richard rubbed his temples, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Her real name is Beatrice Cavendish. Her grandfather just died. She owns Cavendish Shipping." Chloe's laughter died instantly. As a private equity vice president, she knew exactly what Cavendish Holdings was. Everyone on Wall Street did. "Richard, tell me you are joking." "I signed a post-nup," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "I forced her to sign a post-nup. I waived all rights to her assets, all of them. And she knew about the Delaware LLC. She knows about the credit cards." Chloe's eyes widened in sheer horror. "The credit cards, the ones you opened in her name to pay for our trips to Aspen. Richard, that's wire fraud. That's identity theft." Before Richard could answer, his cell phone vibrated violently against the white tablecloth. The caller ID read William Kensington, the founding partner of his firm. Richard answered with a shaking hand. "Richard." "My office." "Now." Kensington barked, his voice laced with venom. "Sir, I'm at lunch. I don't care if you're on the moon, Sterling," Kensington roared. "There are 2 detectives from the NYPD White-Collar Crime Division sitting in my lobby with a subpoena for your corporate emails and trading accounts. A formal complaint of financial fraud has been lodged against you by the legal team of Thomas Harrison. Get here now." The line went dead. Richard dropped the phone. It clattered against the fine china. "What happened?" Chloe demanded, leaning forward, her face pale. "The police are at the office," Richard choked out. "They have a subpoena." Chloe stared at him for 3 agonizing seconds. The arithmetic in her head was fast and brutal. Richard was no longer a rising star with a fat bonus. He was a legal liability, a radioactive asset who had just spectacularly botched the greatest financial windfall in modern history. She stood up, tossing her linen napkin onto the table. "Chloe, wait. Where are you going?" Richard pleaded, reaching for her hand. She pulled away as if he were diseased. "I'm going back to the office to inform William that I had absolutely no knowledge of your fraudulent activities. I suggest you find a very cheap defense attorney, Richard, because you are entirely on your own." She turned on her stiletto heel and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Richard alone with the bill. By the time Richard arrived back at Kensington and Associates, the scene was a corporate nightmare. 2 plainclothes detectives were waiting by the elevator banks. Colleagues he had aggressively stepped on to climb the ladder were watching from behind glass partitions, whispering and pointing. "Richard Sterling?" the taller detective asked, stepping forward. "We need you to come with us to the precinct. We have a warrant to seize your personal electronics, and we have frozen the accounts associated with a Delaware LLC registered under your mother's maiden name." "You can't do this," Richard stammered, his polished arrogance completely shattered. "It's a marital dispute. It's civil, not criminal." "Forging signatures to establish lines of credit across state lines is federal, Mr. Sterling," the second detective replied dryly. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Richard caught a glimpse of himself in the reflective glass of the conference room. He was wearing a $5,000 suit, a Rolex Submariner, and Italian leather shoes. He had spent his entire life crafting the perfect image of a winner, a master of the universe. But as he was marched through the lobby in front of his smirking co-workers, the reality of his situation crashed down on him with the weight of a sinking ship. He had played a dangerous, arrogant game to steal a few pennies, completely blind to the fact that the quiet, unassuming woman he was trying to destroy held the keys to the entire bank. He was walking out of the building with nothing. No wife, no job, no secret fund, and facing years in a federal penitentiary. Beatrice Cavendish hadn't just divorced him. She had surgically and ruthlessly dismantled his entire existence. Rikers Island is not a place designed for men who wear custom Italian wool and complain about the thread count of hotel sheets. Richard Sterling spent 48 hours in a holding cell, shivering on a steel bench, surrounded by the reality of his new life. When his mother finally managed to post his bail, having taken out a brutal second mortgage on her modest home in Connecticut, Richard emerged into the harsh New York sunlight, a changed man. The polished arrogance had been replaced by a feral, frantic desperation. His assets were frozen. His luxury Tribeca apartment was inaccessible, the locks already changed by the property management company at the behest of Thomas Harrison's legal team. He was forced to move into a dingy, roach-infested motel in Queens, but Richard was not ready to concede. In his mind, he was still the victim. He convinced himself that Beatrice had maliciously entrapped him. He managed to secure a meeting with Garrison Cross, a notoriously aggressive Manhattan litigator who specialized in tearing up prenuptial and postnuptial agreements for disgraced celebrities. Cross operated out of a glass and chrome office overlooking Central Park, exuding the predatory energy of a shark that smelled blood in the water. "Fraud by omission, Richard," Cross said, leaning back in his leather chair, tapping a gold pen against his teeth. "That is our golden ticket. Yes, you signed a waiver. Yes, you drafted it. But a contract requires good faith. Your wife deliberately concealed a $14 billion empire. She presented herself as a destitute bookstore clerk. That is textbook material misrepresentation. We don't just fight the criminal wire fraud charges. We counter-sue in civil court to invalidate the divorce settlement. We go after half the Cavendish estate." Richard felt a surge of adrenaline, the first spark of hope in days. "Can we win?" "We don't need to win a trial," Cross smirked. "We just need to make enough noise. Cavendish Shipping relies on stock stability. A messy, highly publicized lawsuit involving the sole heir's fraudulent marriage will spook the shareholders. They will settle quietly just to make us go away. I want 10% of whatever we extract, plus a $100,000 retainer up front." Richard didn't have $100,000. He liquidated his mother's retirement portfolio to pay the retainer, justifying the theft by promising himself he would repay her tenfold once he secured his billionaire settlement. While Richard plotted in his cheap Queens motel room, Beatrice was systematically solidifying her absolute authority across the Atlantic. In the penthouse boardroom of the Cavendish Tower in London, Beatrice sat at the head of the table, projecting an aura of untouchable power. The internal bleeding caused by Gregory Whitmore's corruption had been cauterized. Her next move was expansion. She had her sights set on Nordic Star Freighters, a massive Norwegian shipping conglomerate that controlled the Baltic trade routes. However, acquiring Nordic Star required massive capital underwriting. "We need a lead underwriter to syndicate the debt," Thomas Harrison advised, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Thames. "Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley are ready with pitches." "No," Beatrice said softly, her eyes locked onto a financial dossier. "I want Kensington and Associates." Harrison raised a silver eyebrow. "Kensington, Richard's former firm. They are a boutique private equity house, Beatrice. They barely have the liquidity to manage a deal of this magnitude. They will find it, Beatrice replied, a cold, calculated smile touching her lips. William Kensington prides himself on his firm's prestige. If we offer him the exclusive rights to underwrite the largest shipping merger of the decade, he will leverage every asset he has to make it happen, and in doing so, Cavendish Holdings will effectively own him. 72 hours later, William Kensington, the man who had fired Richard and had him escorted out by police, was sitting in Beatrice's London office, sweating profusely through his bespoke suit. He had flown overnight on a red-eye to secure the deal. "Miss Cavendish, this is an unprecedented opportunity," Kensington stammered, frantically reviewing the term sheets her lawyers had placed before him. "We are deeply honored. And for the record, I want to personally apologize for the unpleasantness regarding your ex-husband. Had I known he was behaving so unethically, I would have terminated him years ago." "Business is business, William," Beatrice said smoothly, sipping her Earl Grey tea. "I only ask one thing. My legal team informs me that Richard is attempting to mount a civil suit against me. He will likely try to call character witnesses from your firm to establish my deception. I need absolute assurance that Kensington and Associates will not be participating in his circus." Kensington paled, violently shaking his head. "Sterling is a pariah, a convicted fraudster waiting for a trial. Nobody at my firm will speak to him, let alone testify for him. You have my word." With a single stroke of a pen, Beatrice had legally and financially isolated Richard from his entire professional network. The Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse loomed like an impenetrable fortress of limestone and glass against the bleak, overcast Manhattan sky. Outside, a chaotic circus of media vans, aggressive paparazzi, and curious onlookers had established a tight perimeter around the steps. The story of the arrogant Midtown finance executive who had maliciously and inadvertently divorced a $14 billion heiress had leaked to the press, and the public was ravenous for the spectacle. Inside courtroom 14B, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Richard Sterling sat at the heavy oak plaintiff's table, his stomach churning with a toxic cocktail of stale motel coffee and sheer, unadulterated panic. He was wearing his only remaining clean suit, a navy wool blend that he had desperately tried to steam in the shower of his roach-infested Queen's motel room. The fabric felt heavy and cheap compared to his seized Italian tailoring. Beside him, Garrison Cross sat perfectly still, organizing his legal pads with the predatory calm of a man who was getting paid regardless of the outcome. Then, the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The gallery fell utterly silent. Beatrice Eleanor Cavendish walked down the center aisle, looking less like a defendant and more like a visiting monarch. She wore a tailored, stark white Dior blazer over a black silk blouse, her posture radiating absolute, terrifying authority. There was no trace of the weeping, cardigan-wearing woman Richard had bullied across a conference table just weeks prior. She was flanked by Thomas Harrison and two towering private security contractors who eyed the gallery with cold professionalism. Beatrice took her seat at the defense table, adjusting her cuffs. She did not cast a single glance in Richard's direction. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, as Judge Maxwell Davies took the bench. Davies was a notoriously strict jurist, a man with a deeply lined face and a legendary intolerance for frivolous litigation. "Be seated," Judge Davies rumbled, peering over his reading glasses at the packed room. "Mr. Cross, I have reviewed your preliminary briefs. You are asking this court to invalidate an ironclad postnuptial agreement, an agreement drafted by your own client, under the premise of fraud by omission." It is an incredibly bold strategy, Counselor, considering your client is currently sitting in my courtroom, out on bail for forging the very defendant's signature to commit wire fraud. Garrison Cross stood, buttoning his jacket, projecting his voice to ensure the reporters in the back row caught every syllable. Your Honor, we are not here to debate my client's pending criminal matters, Cross began, his tone dripping with manufactured righteous indignation. We are here to address a matter of profound marital inequity. A marriage is fundamentally a partnership built on a bedrock of total financial transparency. Miss Cavendish engaged in a highly calculated 5-year campaign of active deception. She hid a $14 billion global corporate empire. When Mr. Sterling drafted the waiver of assets, he was under the legally protected, reasonable assumption that he was divorcing a minimum-wage bookstore employee. Had he known the truth, the financial terms of the dissolution would have been fundamentally, drastically different. She exploited his trust to protect her estate. Judge Davies leaned back, his expression entirely unimpressed. Let me ensure I am translating your legal gymnastics correctly, Mr. Cross. Your client believed his wife was entirely destitute, and therefore he purposefully structured an agreement to leave her with nothing while he walked away with his own hidden assets. But now that he has discovered she is vastly wealthier than he is, he suddenly believes in equitable distribution and wants half of a shipping empire. Is that the crux of your argument? A quiet ripple of laughter moved through the gallery. Richard felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up his neck. Cross forced a tight, polite smile. The law requires absolute transparency in marital dissolution, Your Honor. My client's personal motivations are irrelevant. The defendant intentionally kept him in the dark to defraud him of his legal right to marital property. Noted, Judge Davies said dryly, turning his attention to the defense table. Mr. Harrison, your response to these allegations of fraud by omission? Thomas Harrison stood up slowly. He did not look at Judge Davies, nor did he look at Garrison Cross. He looked directly at Richard, his eyes dead and unblinking. Your Honor, Harrison's deep baritone echoed in the silent courtroom. The plaintiff's argument relies entirely on the legal concept of good faith. Mr. Cross claims his client is a victim of deception who only seeks fairness. However, the defense has expedited evidence to submit this morning. Evidence that definitively proves Mr. Sterling's sudden interest in my client's assets has absolutely nothing to do with marital equity and everything to do with corporate espionage and active, ongoing criminal extortion. Richard frowned, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. Beside him, Cross went rigid, his pen hovering over his legal pad. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? The defense is attempting to smear my client with baseless accusations. Overruled, Judge Davies snapped. You opened the door to his character and motivations, Mr. Cross. I want to see what Mr. Harrison has. Proceed. Harrison nodded to his paralegal, who walked over to the court clerk and handed over a sealed, encrypted hard drive. Your Honor, 48 hours ago, upon assuming unilateral control of Cavendish Holdings, my client initiated a full forensic digital sweep of the company's internal servers in London. We were looking for vulnerabilities left by the recently terminated Chief Operating Officer, a man named Gregory Whitmore. At the mention of Whitmore's name, all the blood violently drained from Richard's face. The courtroom seemed to tilt on its axis. During this sweep of Mr. Whitmore's private encrypted servers, Harrison continued smoothly. Our cybersecurity team intercepted a series of highly secure emails sent from a burner phone in Queens, New York. These emails were sent exactly 3 days after Mr. Sterling was bailed out of Rikers Island. Harrison pressed a button on a small remote in his hand. The massive digital projector screen behind the witness stand flickered to life. The entire courtroom gasped in unison. Displayed in high definition was an email exchange. Sender: I still have access to Beatrice's Brooklyn apartment. I have her old journals, her personal laptops, and 5 years of behavioral profiles. I know her psychological weaknesses and her daily routines. If you want to launch a hostile proxy war to regain control of the Cavendish board, I have the leverage you need to destroy her public image. My price is $20 million in cash, wired to a non-extradition offshore account in Belize. Do we have a deal, Whitmore? Prove you have the laptops and the journals. Then we talk. Your Honor, Harrison said, his voice rising, slicing through the rising murmurs of the gallery like a blade. We immediately subpoenaed the geolocation data for the burner phone that sent these emails. The data shows the device pinged exclusively off a cell tower directly above the Starlight Motel in Queens, the exact specific motel room where the plaintiff, Mr. Richard Sterling, is currently residing. Absolute chaos erupted in the gallery. Reporters frantically typed on their laptops, some standing up to get a better look at the screen. Garrison Cross dropped his gold pen. It clattered loudly against the oak table. He slowly turned his head to look at Richard, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury and disbelief. "You absolute idiot," Cross hissed under his breath, leaning away from Richard as if he were suddenly radioactive. "You tried to extort a foreign corporate board while out on federal bail." "I was desperate," Richard whispered back, his voice cracking, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the table. "I needed leverage. They took everything from me. Bang, bang, bang." Judge Davies slammed his gavel down like a thunderclap, his face flushed with rage. "Order! Order in this court!" The room fell into a terrified silence. The judge glared down at the plaintiff's table, his eyes locked onto Richard with a look of absolute disgust. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Davies said, his voice cold, lethal, and vibrating with anger. "Not only did you attempt to financially ruin your wife during your marriage, but you have the sheer, unmitigated gall to sit in my courtroom and plead for equity while you are actively engaged in an attempt to extort a multinational corporation. You are a danger to the public and an insult to the judicial system." "Your Honor, please," Richard choked out, forcing himself to stand, his knees trembling so badly they knocked together. "I can explain." "Sit down and shut your mouth," the judge roared. Richard collapsed back into his chair as if he had been shot. "The plaintiff's motion to invalidate the postnuptial agreement is denied with extreme prejudice," Judge Davies declared, striking his gavel. "Furthermore, I am immediately revoking the plaintiff's bail entirely, citing a clear and present flight risk, obstruction of justice, and continued egregious criminal activity. Bailiffs, take Mr. Sterling into custody, now." 3 heavily armed U.S. Marshals moved swiftly from the back of the courtroom, their heavy boots thudding against the carpet. Richard couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in. He looked over at the defense table, desperately hoping to find a shred of the timid, submissive woman he had married, hoping she would call them off. Beatrice was already standing. She smoothly adjusted the lapels of her white Dior blazer, her expression perfectly composed. She didn't offer him a look of pity, nor did she gloat or smile. She simply looked at him with the utter, devastating indifference of a billionaire stepping over a piece of trash on the sidewalk. Without a single word, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, her security detail parting the sea of reporters, leaving Richard to be roughly slammed against the oak table and handcuffed by the marshals. Federal sentencing guidelines for wire fraud, identity theft, and attempted corporate extortion are remarkably unforgiving, especially when the defendant's crimes are splashed across the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Richard Sterling's criminal trial began in late November as a bitter frost settled over Manhattan. The spectacle drew crowds. Paparazzi camped outside the Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse, eager to snap photos of the disgraced private equity director who had inadvertently handed away a shipping empire. Richard arrived each morning in the back of a secure transport van, his once immaculate posture hunched, his designer suits replaced by the drab, ill-fitting khaki uniform of the Federal Corrections System. Assistant United States Attorney Samantha Reynolds did not just prosecute Richard. She surgically dismantled his entire existence. Over the course of 3 agonizing weeks, Reynolds paraded Richard's deceit before a jury of 12 ordinary citizens. She produced the forged signatures on the credit card applications. She played security footage of Richard at bank branches, charming tellers while legally burying his wife in consumer debt. She brought forward forensic accountants who meticulously traced the path of his hidden bonuses into the Delaware Shell Company. But the most devastating blow came on the 8th day of the trial, when the prosecution called their star witness. Chloe Brentwood walked into the courtroom wearing a conservative navy suit, looking pale and deeply uncomfortable. Having been fired from Kensington and Associates and blacklisted from every reputable financial institution in New York, Chloe had eagerly accepted an immunity deal in exchange for her testimony. Richard watched from the defense table, his hands shackled to his waist chain, as the woman he had risked everything for took the stand. "Ms. Brentwood," Prosecutor Reynolds asked, projecting her voice across the silent room, "were you aware that the defendant was funding your extravagant vacations using fraudulent lines of credit opened in his wife's name?" "I was not," Chloe answered, refusing to look in Richard's direction. "Richard told me he was independently wealthy. He told me his wife was a financial parasite, a drain on his resources. When I discovered the truth, that he was stealing her identity and committing federal crimes, I was horrified. I ended the relationship immediately." Richard closed his eyes, a profound, sickening hollowness opening in his chest. Chloe was lying to save herself, but it didn't matter. The jury believed her. They saw Richard exactly as he was, a greedy, manipulative narcissist who had tried to build a throne on a foundation of lies. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The foreperson, a retired public school teacher, stood up and delivered the verdicts without a hint of emotion. Guilty on 3 counts of wire fraud, guilty on 1 count of aggravated identity theft, guilty on 1 count of attempted extortion. Judge Robert Mitchell did not offer leniency, citing Richard's absolute lack of remorse and his audacious attempt to extort a foreign corporation while out on bail. The judge handed down a sentence of 96 months, 8 full years, in a medium-security federal penitentiary, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release and absolute financial restitution to the Cavendish estate. 4,000 miles away, in a world utterly untouched by the squalor of the New York criminal justice system, Beatrice Eleanor Cavendish was cementing her legacy. The acquisition of Nordic Star freighters had closed ahead of schedule, officially making Cavendish Holdings the undisputed titan of global maritime logistics. To celebrate the merger and her formal coronation as the head of the empire, Beatrice hosted a private gala at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The Great Hall was bathed in warm, golden light, filled with foreign dignitaries, industry barons, and the global elite. Beatrice stood near the center of the room, wearing a breathtaking, custom-tailored emerald silk gown that commanded the attention of every eye in the building. She held a flute of vintage champagne, conversing fluently in French with the Minister of Trade. Thomas Harrison, ever the loyal sentinel, approached her side holding a silver tray with a single encrypted tablet resting on it. "Forgive the interruption, Miss Cavendish," Harrison murmured, his tone as composed as ever. "We just received word from our legal attachés in New York. The sentencing concluded an hour ago. Mr. Sterling received 8 years in federal custody. The extortion charges stuck." Beatrice did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply took a slow, measured sip of her champagne, her expression perfectly serene. "Thank you, Thomas," she replied softly. "Ensure that our charitable foundation, the one dedicated to providing legal aid for victims of financial abuse in marriages, receives a public endowment of $22,000 tomorrow morning, the exact amount of debt he attempted to leave me with." Harrison offered a rare, slight smile. "A poetic figure, ma'am. I will see to it immediately." As Harrison walked away to issue the directives, Beatrice looked out over the sea of powerful people laughing and mingling beneath the museum's vaulted ceilings. She had spent 5 years playing the part of a fragile, broken bird, studying the cruelty of a man who thought he owned her. She had learned exactly how ruthless the world could be. And now she owned the world. 2 years later, the fluorescent lights of the cafeteria at the Allenwood Federal Correctional Institution flickered with a low, irritating hum. Richard Sterling sat at a stainless steel table, wearing his faded orange jumpsuit. His hair had thinned dramatically, and the sharp, arrogant angles of his face had softened into a mask of permanent, exhausted defeat. He was eating a plate of lukewarm, heavily processed macaroni. A younger inmate, a kid doing time for mail fraud, dropped a dog-eared, month-old copy of Forbes magazine onto the table before taking the seat across from him. "Check it out, Sterling," the kid said, tapping the glossy cover. "They're saying she's going to buy out the South American ports next. Unbelievable." Richard slowly lowered his plastic spork. He stared down at the magazine. Staring back at him was Beatrice. She was seated behind her grandfather's massive oak desk in London, wearing a sharp, impeccable pinstripe suit. Her hair was pulled back in that severe, elegant knot. Her eyes, the same eyes that used to well up with tears when he berated her over grocery bills, were now terrifyingly cold, sharp, and focused. The headline, printed in bold gold lettering across the bottom of the page, read, "The Iron Heiress: How Beatrice Cavendish Outsmarted Wall Street and Conquered the Seas." Richard stared at the cover until his vision blurred. He thought about the cheap IKEA dining table in Brooklyn. He thought about the post-nuptial agreement he had so eagerly, so aggressively demanded she sign. He thought about the sneer on his own face as he told her she was nothing without him. His chest hitched. A quiet, suffocating sob clawed its way up his throat, echoing in the noisy, sterile prison cafeteria. He pushed the magazine away, buried his face in his rough, calloused hands, and wept for the ghost of the billionaire he had thrown away. Divorce, at its core, is a legal separation of lives, a severing of what was once a shared future. For Richard Sterling, it was a masterclass in hubris, a fatal miscalculation born of his blinding arrogance and petty greed. He sought to discard a woman he deemed beneath him, only to discover she was the architect of his total ruin. Beatrice Cavendish did not just survive the financial ambush her husband laid for her. She weaponized his own malice against him, transforming a pauper's exit into a billionaire's coronation. The tragedy of Richard was never that he lost a fortune he never truly possessed. His absolute, ultimate punishment was the agonizing, inescapable knowledge that he held an empire in his hands and willingly threw it away for pennies. Sometimes, the most terrifying power a person can wield is simply allowing their enemy to legally sign their own absolute, catastrophic downfall.